A man announced to the world he had flown where no one had ever flown before, and a scientific society verified his math within a single minute. 70 years later, an archivist working through old boxes found his actual handwritten notes from that exact flight, untouched since 1926. Something in his own writing did not match his story. The flight that made him a national hero. On May 9, 1926, American naval officer Richard Byrd announced that he and pilot Floyd Bennett had become the first people to fly over the North Pole. The pair took off from Spitsbergen, Norway, aboard a 3-engine Fokker aircraft called the Josephine Ford, returning roughly 16 hours later, claiming success. The timing was dramatic. Byrd's flight came just 3 days before Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen was set to attempt his own crossing by airship. Had Byrd not claimed it first, credit would likely have gone to Amundsen instead, since his airship completed its own crossing on May 12th. The National Geographic Society, which had sponsored the expedition, moved quickly to verify Byrd's claim. He returned home to a hero's welcome, receiving the Medal of Honor within weeks. That fame didn't stay unquestioned for long. Journalists and fellow aviators soon began asking whether the Josephine Ford could realistically have covered the distance in the 16 hours Byrd claimed. Before those doubts spread far, an official body of experts stepped in to examine his paperwork directly. The committee that cleared him. In the weeks after the flight, Byrd submitted his navigational records to the Navy and to a special committee appointed by the National Geographic Society, including figures like Dr. Gilbert Grosvenor and Dr. Frederick Coville, working alongside outside navigation experts. The committee's findings, published in the New York Times in June 1926, backed him fully. After recalculating his observations and replotting the flight path, they found his calculated arrival at the pole varied by only 1 minute from their own numbers. Byrd had taken 10 sextant readings during the flight, 4 near the pole itself, and the committee stated his records substantiated his claim in every particular. One detail stood out. On the return leg, Byrd's sextant slid off its table and its horizon glass broke, forcing him onto dead reckoning, estimating position from speed and heading rather than direct readings for the rest of the trip home. At the time, this seemed a minor equipment issue, since the committee had already verified the outbound leg using his earlier sextant readings. With that official backing, Byrd's story held up publicly for decades. It didn't stop a small group of critics, including one man who had worked directly with his team, from quietly questioning the math for years afterward. The doubts that started almost immediately. Skepticism about Byrd's flight built steadily even after the Society's endorsement. Aviation experts kept pointing out that reaching the pole and back in the recorded time would have required speeds faster than the Josephine Ford was believed capable of. In 1960, Swedish meteorologist G.H. Liljequist published an analysis arguing weather records showed a stationary high-pressure ridge along Byrd's flight path that day, meaning no tailwind existed to explain the timing. Separately, aviator Bernd Balchen, who had assisted Byrd's 1926 expedition, argued as early as 1958 that his own knowledge of the plane's true airspeed made Byrd's timing essentially impossible. Balchen went further, claiming pilot Floyd Bennett had privately confessed months later that they never reached the pole at all, that an oil leak had forced them to fly a back-and-forth pattern near their departure point until enough time passed to fake it. Bennett himself told a different story before his death. Before dying in 1928 on a rescue flight to Greenland, he had written a memoir, given interviews, and authored a magazine article, all confirming Byrd's version. That leaves two contradictory accounts: Bennett's own repeated, first-hand confirmation while alive, against a second-hand claim from Balchin that surfaced only after Bennett could no longer respond. That contradiction gets more complicated once you know Balchin's relationship with Byrd was not simply that of two impartial colleagues. The complicated friendship behind the accusation. Bernd Balchin was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished polar aviators of his generation. He set multiple genuine polar flight records over the course of his career, and later organized several daring wartime air operations during World War II, eventually becoming a respected leader in American Arctic aviation circles. For years, Balchin worked closely with Byrd, even serving as the actual pilot on Byrd's later, well-corroborated 1929 South Pole flight. According to a later biography of Balchin written by Carol Glines, that professional relationship soured considerably over time. Glines documented claims that Byrd's respect for Balchin's genuine flying talent gradually eroded into something closer to rivalry, and that Byrd used his own considerable post-war influence to help block Balchin's expected promotion to brigadier general. A setback that eventually contributed to Balchin's forced retirement from military service in 1956. Glines further documented that pressure from Byrd's supporters reportedly led Balchin's publisher to remove certain material critical of Byrd from Balchin's own 1958 autobiography before it went to print. None of this proves definitively whether Balchin's account of Bennett's alleged confession was true or false. It does mean that by the time Balchin went public with his doubts about the 1926 flight, the two men's professional relationship had already curdled into something considerably more personal than a simple disagreement over navigation math. Historians studying this specific controversy have generally treated Balchin's account as a serious, credible piece of evidence worth taking seriously, while also acknowledging that his personal history with Byrd complicates any assumption that his testimony was entirely free of bias in either direction. For most of the 20th century, this dispute remained largely a matter of second-hand testimony, weather calculations, and competing aviation math, with no direct, first-hand written record from Byrd himself available for historians to examine. That would finally change in 1996, when an archivist working quietly through old university boxes came across something nobody had seen in 70 years. The diary that sat sealed for 70 years. In 1996, Ohio State University archivist Raymond Gorler was cataloging Byrd's massive personal paper collection, roughly 523 cubic feet of documents donated to the university across two separate acquisitions in 1985 and 1990, when he came across a small, handwritten notebook. Its cover read 1925, but flipping through the pages revealed something the label did not mention. Byrd had reused the same blank notebook the following year, in 1926, to record his North Pole flight, and again a year after that, in 1927, for his transatlantic flight following Charles Lindbergh's historic solo crossing. Because the plane's engine noise made spoken conversation with his pilot essentially impossible during the actual flight, Byrd had used pages of this same notebook as a running written conversation pad between himself and Bennett, jotting quick notes back and forth mid-flight alongside his official navigation calculations. That detail alone made the notebook an extraordinary, deeply personal window into exactly what Byrd was thinking and calculating in real time during the single most famous flight of his career. The complete notebook ran to 121 pages in total, with 76 pages devoted to the North Pole flight, 8 pages covering the 1927 transatlantic crossing, and 37 pages recording an earlier 1925 expedition Byrd had taken part in, alongside explorer Donald Macmillan in Greenland. Gorler described the discovery as one of the most remarkable finds in the entire history of polar archival research. Ohio State University Press published a full transcription of the diary in 1998 under the title "To the Pole," making Byrd's actual, contemporaneous handwritten notes from that day publicly available for scholars to examine directly for the very first time. Interestingly, internal records show that Ohio State's own university press had initially decided not to publish the diary at all, before reversing that decision by September 1996, once a new press director recognized its historical significance and encouraged Gorler to prepare it for print. What those scholars found inside would reopen a controversy that had simmered quietly for 7 decades. The erasures that reopened the case. Once researchers began closely examining the diary's actual navigational calculations, several details stood out immediately. Some of the sextant readings and math Byrd had recorded appeared to contain genuine errors. Far more strikingly, certain entries showed legible erasures at exactly the critical points in the flight where Byrd would have been calculating his precise distance from the pole. Historian and navigation specialist Dennis Rawlins conducted a detailed examination of these erasures and published his findings in the academic journal Polar Record, concluding that the evidence pointed toward Byrd and Bennett turning back roughly 150 miles, or about 2 hours of flying time, short of the actual pole, likely somewhere near the 88th degree of latitude rather than the 90th. According to Rawlins's analysis, reported at the time by the New York Times, the erased and altered calculations suggested Byrd likely knew at the time that he had not actually reached his destination, despite his public announcement claiming otherwise. Rawlins later summarized his own conclusion bluntly, writing that while Byrd and Bennett had genuinely achieved a real farthest north position and made a heroic attempt to reach the pole, the evidence showed clearly that they never actually arrived at their destination. The Washington Post covered the same story under the direct headline, "Diary Disputes, Byrd's Polar Claim," reporting that Byrd may have turned back roughly 2 hours and 150 miles short of his goal. This was no longer second-hand gossip about a confession relayed decades after the fact. This was Byrd's own handwriting, preserved for 70 years, seemingly showing signs of having been altered at precisely the moments that mattered most for proving or disproving his historic claim. That should have settled the matter for good. Instead, a separate group of researchers, working with the exact same diary pages, arrived at a considerably more forgiving conclusion. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. The case that still isn't fully closed. Not every historian who examined Byrd's diary agreed with Rawlins's harsher interpretation. Ohio State astronomer G.H. Newsom conducted his own separate analysis of Byrd's navigation methods, published through the same Polar Record journal that had carried Rawlins's original findings, focusing specifically on a technique called dead reckoning, where a pilot estimates distance traveled using speed, heading, and elapsed time, rather than direct positional fixes. Newsom's research found that Byrd's specific dead reckoning method could, in principle, produce a reasonably accurate result under ideal conditions, but that real-world factors present during the actual 1926 flight, including the specific limitations of the drift indicator instrument Byrd used, could easily introduce significant unintentional errors of exactly the kind found in the diary. Crucially, Newsom noted that no complete navigation log from the flight has ever been recovered, meaning historians are forced to reconstruct exactly what happened, using only the surviving diary pages themselves. An inherently incomplete record. In a personal 1997 letter to Gorler held in the Ohio State Archives, Newsom laid out his ongoing concerns about drawing overly firm conclusions from the same erasures Rawlins had treated as decisive. A later 2013 examination, led by Ohio State researchers, again concluded that Byrd likely fell short of the pole, a finding that made national news once more nearly 2 decades after the original diary discovery. Even this later study, however, stopped short of asserting that Byrd had deliberately and knowingly lied about it, treating the question of intent as genuinely separate from the question of whether he actually arrived. That split, professional historians examining the identical physical document and reaching different conclusions about intent versus honest error, is exactly why this specific controversy has never been fully resolved, even decades after the diary itself became public. What nearly everyone studying the case does agree on is that the flight fell meaningfully short of definitively proving Byrd reached the pole, whatever his own state of mind may have been at the time. That lingering doubt over his most famous flight makes what happened next in his career worth looking at closely, since it involves an entirely separate polar achievement that has never faced anywhere near the same level of scrutiny. The South Pole flight. Nobody disputes. In 1928, 2 years after the disputed North Pole flight, Byrd led his first full Antarctic expedition, arriving with 42 men, 84 sled dogs, 2 ships, and 3 planes, and establishing a base camp called Little America on the Ross Ice Shelf. Unlike the earlier attempt, this involved sustained fieldwork, photographic surveys, and constant radio contact with the outside world. On November 28th and 29th, 1929, Byrd flew over the South Pole with pilot Bernd Balchen, the same aviator who later doubted the North Pole flight, along with co-pilot Harold June and photographer Ashley McKinley. The crew completed the round trip in 18 hours and 41 minutes, launching from and returning to Little America with radio contact and ground support the entire way. This flight has never faced anywhere near the same dispute as its northern counterpart, largely because it launched from a fixed, monitored base rather than relying on one pilot's solo calculations. Notably, Balchen himself never disputed this flight's legitimacy, despite his later doubts about 1926. That corroborated South Pole flight became the foundation of Byrd's career. He returned to Antarctica for a full year from 1933 to 1935 and led or oversaw 5 expeditions total between 1928 and 1956. Along with his Medal of Honor, he received the Navy Cross, multiple Legion of Merit awards, and a Distinguished Flying Cross, cementing his reputation as one of America's most decorated explorers. That career eventually led Byrd to command the largest Antarctic operation of his life, one that would end abruptly and hand conspiracy theorists a story that still circulates today. Operation High Jump, and the phrase that got misused. In August 1946, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump, officially titled the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, with Rear Admiral Richard Byrd serving as the operations officer in charge. It was, by a wide margin, the largest Antarctic expedition ever attempted up to that point, involving 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and roughly 4,700 personnel organized into several separate task forces, each assigned specific responsibilities, including coastline mapping, base construction, and scientific data collection. The task force reached the Bay of Whales on January 15, 1947, and began constructing a research base called Little America 4. During the operation, Navy pilot David Bunger, flying a separate reconnaissance mission, discovered an unusual ice-free region containing warm lakes, a genuine geographic feature that researchers subsequently named the Bunger Hills in his honor. A real, scientifically documented discovery that later became fodder for exaggerated claims about mysterious warm valleys hidden beneath the ice. The operation's stated purpose was to train American naval personnel in cold weather operations, test equipment under extreme conditions, and establish a stronger long-term American research presence on the continent, all conducted against the early backdrop of Cold War strategic planning. Naval ships and personnel were withdrawn back to the United States in late February 1947, several months earlier than originally planned, with official records attributing the early departure to the approaching Antarctic winter and rapidly worsening weather conditions. That earlier than expected withdrawal, combined with a specific radio interview Byrd gave from his command ship, and a separate statement he made afterward to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, warning that the United States should adopt protective measures against the possibility of attack by hostile aircraft capable of flying between the poles at incredible speed. A comment clearly reflecting genuine early Cold War anxiety about Soviet aviation capability rather than anything supernatural, gave later conspiracy writers exactly the kind of ambiguous material they needed to build an entirely different story around. One writer in particular took Byrd's actual, verifiable words and quotes, then built something around them that had nothing to do with what Byrd had actually meant. The book that invented the Hollow Earth Diary. In 1964, an author named Walter Siegmeister, writing under the pseudonym Dr. Raymond Bernard, published a book titled The Hollow Earth, subtitled The Greatest Geographical Discovery in History, made by Admiral Richard E. Byrd in the mysterious land beyond the poles. Siegmeister held a range of unconventional personal beliefs well outside the hollow earth theory alone, reportedly promoting ideas connected to eugenics and mass colonization earlier in his career, and later, by the 1960s, becoming an advocate of breatharianism, the belief that human beings could sustain themselves on air alone without food. Siegmeister built his hollow earth claims partly on an earlier, already misquoted 1947 radio interview in which Byrd had poetically described Antarctica's unmapped interior. A separate writer named Giannini had already taken that interview and misrepresented it years earlier. incorrectly claiming Byrd said he had flown 1,700 miles beyond the North Pole into some kind of hidden interior land, when Byrd had actually been describing Antarctica in the opposite hemisphere entirely, and lamenting that Operation Highjump's early termination had cut his exploration short before he could map more of the continent's interior. Siegmeister folded that already distorted quote into a much larger, fully invented narrative, claiming Byrd had personally flown through a hidden polar opening into the interior of the Earth itself, discovering flying saucers, a hidden civilization, and ancient legends connected to mythical underground realms sometimes called Agartha or Shambhala in various older traditions. None of this had any basis in anything Byrd actually wrote, said, or experienced. The hoax escalated further in the late 1970s when a separate text titled "The Missing Secret Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd" began circulating through mail-order catalogs and UFO conferences, again carrying Bernard's introduction. This supposed diary described a dramatic February 19th, 1947 flight in which Byrd's instruments malfunctioned before he discovered a warm, ice-free valley containing forests, a living mammoth, and a crystal city, all before encountering strange, disc-shaped aircraft. Byrd genuinely did fly deep into the Antarctic interior on that exact date during Operation Highjump, which is precisely what gave the fabricated diary just enough real historical detail to feel credible to readers unfamiliar with the actual mission records. No authentic version of this diary has ever been located in Byrd's extensive, well-documented personal archive at Ohio State University, and no credible historian studying his papers has ever treated the document as genuine. Byrd's only genuine published first-hand account of his Antarctic experiences remains a book he wrote himself, titled Alone, describing an entirely different, well-documented ordeal during his 1933 to 1935 expedition, when he spent several months living in near isolation at a remote weather station and nearly died from carbon monoxide poisoning caused by a faulty stove. Understanding that this specific Hollow Earth diary was invented decades after Byrd's death by a writer with no connection to him whatsoever matters enormously for understanding why a very similar story keeps resurfacing online today, just wearing a slightly different disguise. Why the myth keeps coming back. In recent years, a wave of online videos has circulated claiming that the last surviving member of Byrd's expedition finally broke his silence before dying, revealing hidden truths about Antarctica that the government supposedly suppressed for decades. These videos consistently follow the same basic pattern: dramatic titles promising a deathbed confession, vague references to suppressed government secrets, and claims of ancient civilizations or unexplained warmth hidden beneath the ice, closely echoing the same basic structure Siegmeister invented back in 1964. None of these videos name a real, independently verifiable individual with a documented service record connecting them to any actual Byrd expedition. None cite an actual primary source, an interview transcript, a published memoir, or an archival document anyone could independently check. Genuine expedition members from Byrd's actual voyages, including people like Harold Gilmore, who served as the official recorder and historian for the 1939 to 1941 United States Antarctic Service Expedition, and kept a detailed daily journal of the entire voyage, left behind real, verifiable documentation held in institutions like the National Archives in Washington, records historians can and do examine directly. The recent viral Last Survivor videos offer nothing comparable. No name that checks out, no archive that holds their supposed testimony, and no connection to any of Byrd's real documented crew members. What these videos are actually doing is recycling the same basic Hollow Earth narrative Walter Siegmeister invented back in 1964, repackaged with a new fictional narrator and dressed up using the emotional weight of a dying man's final confession. A storytelling technique that works precisely because it discourages the kind of skepticism a reader might apply to an ordinary, unnamed internet claim. Understanding this pattern does not require dismissing genuine curiosity about Antarctica or about Byrd's real, complicated legacy. It simply means recognizing that this specific supposed testimony, unlike Byrd's actual sealed 1926 diary, discovered by a real archivist in a real university archive, has no comparable paper trail behind it at all. Verdict. Here is where things actually stand. Richard Byrd announced on May 9, 1926, that he and pilot Floyd Bennett had become the first people to fly over the North Pole, a claim that made him instantly famous and earned him the Medal of Honor, backed at the time by a formal National Geographic Society committee that recalculated his navigation and found it accurate within a single minute. Doubts persisted anyway, based on aircraft speed and weather calculations, and grew further when Bernd Balchen, a pilot whose own later relationship with Byrd had grown openly bitter, claimed Bennett had privately confessed the flight fell short, a claim complicated by the fact that Bennett himself had repeatedly confirmed Byrd's version in writing before his death in 1928. In 1996, Ohio State University archivist Raymond Gorler discovered Byrd's actual handwritten diary from the flight, sealed away for 70 years, and researcher Dennis Rawlins's subsequent analysis of legible erasures within it concluded Byrd likely turned back roughly 150 miles short of the pole while still publicly claiming success. A separate historian, G.H. Newsom, examined the same document and argued the errors could plausibly reflect honest navigational mistakes, particularly given a sextant that broke on the return leg, rather than deliberate deception. And a 2013 Ohio State-led review, again, found Byrd likely fell short without settling the question of intent. That specific, genuine historical debate remains unresolved among serious researchers to this day. Byrd's later, well-documented South Pole flight in 1929, flown from a fixed base camp with a full ground support crew, and his subsequent decades-long Antarctic career, including commanding the massive, from 1946 to 1947, Operation High Jump, were never subject to anywhere near the same level of doubt. The Hollow Earth legend now widely associated with his name traces directly back to a 1964 book written by Walter Siegmeister under a pseudonym, built on a misquoted 1947 interview with no authentic diary, document, or witness ever verified to support it. A fictional origin story that modern viral videos claiming a last surviving witness continue to recycle today without offering a single verifiable name or source of their own. The real mystery here was never a hidden world beneath the ice. It was a famous man's own handwriting, quietly disputing the story he told the entire world, sitting in a box for 70 years before anyone thought to look closely enough to notice. If this kind of deep history mystery is your thing, subscribing helps more of these stories reach you the moment they come out.